Okay, let's unpack this. You shared some sources with us that tackle a concept that, for a lot of people, and I'll admit, initially for me too, sounds like the absolute opposite of getting things done. The concept is surrender.
And that's such a common reaction. We hear surrender and immediately think of defeat, giving up, maybe even a kind of passive fatalism.
Yeah, exactly.
It brings up that immediate tension. If you just accept things the way they are, how do you possibly make progress? How do you change a bad situation?
Right.
It feels like it flies in the face of ambition and effort.
Right. My first thought is, but innovation comes from not accepting the status quo. This material you've provided seems to propose a radically different understanding of what true surrender actually means.
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive is to explore this stack of sources to see what true surrender looks like according to this perspective. We want to understand how it reconciles with taking action and making positive changes in your life,
Hmm.
and why the material presents it as a potentially powerful, even necessary approach for navigating challenges and transforming yourself. We're diving into that core question: how can acceptance lead to progress?
All right, let's jump in then. The first thing the source seems to want to clarify is what this surrender isn't.
Yes, it's really important that the source tackles those common misconceptions right off the bat. It's very clear. True surrender in this context is not about defeat.
Okay.
It's not giving up. It's not failing to face challenges or becoming lethargic. It absolutely does not mean passively putting up with an unpleasant situation and doing nothing to change it.
Right. No abandoning plans either.
No, nor does it mean abandoning plans or positive action. That's
Yeah.
crucial.
Okay, so if it's not giving up or being passive, what is it?
The source describes it as a simple but profound wisdom of yielding to rather than opposing the flow of life.
Yielding to the flow.
And because the only place you can truly experience the flow of life is in the present moment, this translates to accepting the present moment unconditionally without any internal reservation.
Accepting the present moment.
Yeah.
Okay, that feels like a key distinction from accepting your entire difficult life situation.
It absolutely is. The core of it is relinquishing inner resistance to what is.
Inner resistance. Can you break down what the source means by that? What does that look like?
Sure, inner resistance is described as essentially saying an internal no to the present moment. It manifests primarily through mental judgment, labeling the situation, yourself, others, and the resulting emotional negativity.
The judgment and negativity loop.
Exactly. And the source notes this resistance becomes particularly obvious when things don't go according to your mind's expectations when they go wrong. That discrepancy between what your mind insists should be and what is reality, particularly in challenging moments,
Yeah.
is what the source calls the pain gap.
The pain gap, that space between expectation and reality, filled with resistance. And the source says surrender is the way to bridge that gap.
Precisely. It suggests that accepting what is in the moment immediately liberates you from identification with the complaining, judging mind. The resistance, according to this material, is the mind in action in that specific moment.
Okay.
And here's the critical part. Surrender is presented as a purely inner phenomenon. It has nothing to do with whether you take action on the outer level.
So it's internal.
Totally internal. You don't have to accept the overall undesirable situation. You just surrender to the tiny segment of it called the now.
Okay, that makes more sense already. It's about an internal state, not external inaction. The source uses a great analogy for this being stuck in the mud.
Yes, that example really highlights the difference between the type of surrender this material advocates and simple resignation. If you're stuck in the mud, resignation is like saying, well, I guess I'm just stuck now, nothing I can do.
Which isn't helpful.
Right. This source says that's not surrender. You fully acknowledge you want to get out.
You absolutely recognize you want to change the situation. No question.
Right. The surrendered approach, according to this material, is to first recognize you want to get out, but then, in the present moment, bring your attention right down to this instant.
Okay.
Without mental labeling, no internal commentary about how bad it is or how you shouldn't be stuck, you accept the isness of this immediate situation.
Just what is right now.
Just what is. And from that state of inner non-resistance and emotional neutrality, then you take action. The source calls this positive action, suggesting it's far more effective because it's not driven by the heavy energy of anger, frustration, or despair.
And while you're trying to get out, you just keep coming back to surrendering to this moment without labeling it again and again.
Exactly. The source gives another helpful image. Imagine you're moving through thick fog at night.
Okay.
The fog is your entire life situation with all its past and future problems and worries. You have a flashlight, which is your conscious presence.
Yeah.
When you turn it on, it creates a clear space in front of you, cutting through the fog. That clear space is the now. Surrender is shining the flashlight of your conscious presence only on that clear space, focusing on the immediate present rather than getting lost in the fog of the overall situation.
That picture really helps clarify the focus. It's about where your conscious energy is directed right now. So what happens if you don't practice this kind of surrender? What's the price paid for inner resistance, according to the source?
Well, this material describes significant consequences. On a psychological level, non-surrender hardens what it calls the psychological form, which is essentially the ego's defense
The
structure.
ego shell.
Yeah, exactly. This creates a strong feeling of separateness and makes you perceive the world, and especially other people, as potential threats. It can manifest as an unconscious drive to criticize, judge, compete, or dominate others. Even nature can be seen as something to conquer.
Wow.
The source goes as far as to mention paranoia as a more severe expression of this resistant mind-identified state.
That sounds exhausting and kind of lonely. And it affects the body too. I think you mentioned that.
Yes, the source explicitly links inner resistance to physical effects. It says not only the psychological form, but the physical body itself becomes hard and rigid. This creates tension in different parts of the body and restricts the natural flow of life energy, which is crucial for well-being.
So physical tension comes from inner resistance.
That's the argument. And while therapies like bodywork might relieve symptoms, the source argues they won't dissolve the underlying cause, the pattern of resistance, unless they are accompanied by this practice of everyday surrender.
So our inner state of resistance is directly impacting our outer experience and even our physical health. It's all connected.
That's the connection the source makes. However, it also points to something within you that remains completely untouched by these transient situations. It's your life itself, your very being, which is always accessible in the timeless present moment. Surrender, in this framework, is the means to access this inner core, this unaffected reality. The source references Jesus' phrase, the one thing that is needed, in relation to this inner state.
Accessing that unchanging core amidst changing circumstances. That does sound like a powerful foundation, which naturally leads us to how this concept of surrender can actually be a catalyst for change. If your situation is undesirable, this source says you need to surrender first. That still feels a bit backwards.
It is counterintuitive, but that's the central claim. If you find your life situation unsatisfactory, the source insists you must first surrender to it to break the unconscious pattern of resistance that is actually keeping that situation in place.
But that's a paradox. If I surrender to being stuck, won't I lose the motivation to get unstuck? Where does the drive come from?
The source addresses this head-on. It emphasizes that surrender is perfectly compatible with taking action, setting goals, and driving change. The key difference is the energy that flows into your actions when you're in a state of surrender.
A different energy.
Yes, it's described as a different quality of energy.
A different quality. How so? What does that mean?
This energy is described as being reconnected with the source energy of being. When your doing comes from this place, it's no longer a struggle. The source suggests it becomes a joyful celebration of life energy that actually pulls you deeper into the now.
A joyful celebration.
Right. Non-resistance in this material enhances the quality of both your consciousness and your actions immeasurably, and your results will reflect that higher quality. This is called surrendered action.
Joyful celebration of action sounds, well, revolutionary compared to the usual grind. The source even speculates that the very word work might eventually become obsolete as humans awaken.
It offers that possibility, yeah. And this material strongly asserts that the quality of your consciousness in this very moment is the primary factor determining your future reality. Therefore, surrender is presented as the most important thing for positive change.
More important than the action itself.
Action, while necessary, is secondary, according to this. The source states quite unequivocally, no truly positive action can originate from a state of consciousness that is unsurrendered.
Okay, I'm starting to see how these pieces connect, but it does bring up that core question again. If dissatisfaction isn't the engine for change, where does the energy and clarity for action come from in a surrendered state? If I'm okay with the now, why act?
Well, the source explains that in surrender, you gain immense clarity. You see exactly what needs to be done in the present moment. Action happens not from a place of pushing against reality, but by simply focusing on one thing at a time.
One thing at a time, not the crushing weight of the whole situation or future goals. That makes sense.
Exactly. The source uses nature as an example. Everything needed gets done. The miracle of life unfolds without any apparent dissatisfaction or struggle. It quotes Jesus saying, "Look at the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin."
Ah, right.
This surrendered action taps into that effortless, natural unfolding.
So if someone is in an unpleasant overall situation, how do they apply this practically, according to the source? What are the steps?
Okay, first, separate out this one instant. Surrender to what is in this moment. Use that flashlight analogy, direct your conscious presence to the now.
Focus the beam.
Right. When you do this, your state of consciousness is no longer dictated by external conditions. You're free from the automatic reaction of resistance. Then, from that state of inner freedom, look at the specifics of the situation. Ask yourself genuinely, is there anything I can do right now to change, improve, or remove myself from this?
And if there is some,
Take that action. The source is specific. Focus only on the one thing you can do in this immediate moment. Don't get lost in the list of future tasks or running mental movies about potential outcomes, which pulls you out of the now.
avoid the mental projections.
Exactly. Planning can be the one thing you do now, but it should be focused and present, not future tripping.
What if that action doesn't immediately fix everything? Which, let's be honest, it often doesn't.
Then the source advises, until the desired result is achieved, do not resist what is happening in the present moment. Keep surrendering to the now as it is, even while you're acting.
And if no action is possible at all, if you are genuinely stuck in an unavoidable, unpleasant situation, what then?
This is where the source says you have to use the situation to go deeper into surrender, into the now, into being. By entering this timeless dimension, the situation itself can actually become a catalyst for inner transformation.
Use the difficulty itself.
Exactly. The source suggests that change can then happen in unexpected ways, sometimes with very little effort on your part, as life itself can become more cooperative. Inner blocks like fear, guilt, or inertia dissolve in the light of conscious presence.
That's a powerful reframing. The difficulty becomes a tool for deeper awareness. The source also makes sure to differentiate this from just being lazy or apathetic, right? Like saying, oh, well.
Absolutely. It explicitly states that thinking, "I can't be bothered," or "I just don't care," is not surrender. Look closely, and it's usually a form of mask resistance, tinged with negativity or resentment.
Hidden resistance.
Yeah. The source encourages intense self-honesty and alertness. When you surrender, check inward to make sure there aren't hidden pockets of resistance hiding away.
That brings us to the really practical question the source anticipates.
Right.
Okay, letting go of resistance sounds great, but how do you actually do that? How do you let go when you're feeling it strongly?
Right, the how-to. The source's answer is deceptively simple. Begin by acknowledging the resistance when it's there. Be there as it arises.
Just notice it.
Just notice it. Observe how your mind is creating it. Notice the thoughts, labeling the situation, yourself or others. Look at the thought process. Feel the energy of the emotion in your body.
Witnessing the resistance itself, is that the key?
Exactly. By witnessing the resistance, you see it for what it is and that it serves no true purpose. And here's the mechanism described. By focusing all your attention on the whole. Now, the previously unconscious resistance becomes conscious, and the source states, that is the end of it.
That is the end of it. That sounds almost too easy, like just becoming aware makes it disappear.
Well, it's simple, but requires practice and presence. The source explains why this works. You cannot be truly conscious and simultaneously unhappy or negative.
Can't be conscious and negative at the same time.
That's the claim. Negativity, unhappiness, suffering, whatever form it takes, exists because there is resistance. And resistance, the source argues, is always unconscious.
But wait, surely I can be conscious of my unhappy feelings. I know I'm feeling them. That seems obvious.
Ah, yes, the source addresses this specific point. It suggests that what you perceive as being conscious of unhappy feelings is actually being identified with them. You're caught in them.
Identified with them.
Yes, you keep them alive through compulsive thinking, a constant internal narrative about the feeling which is itself unconscious. If you were truly, completely conscious, totally present in the tea-fit, now any negativity would, according to this material, dissolve almost instantly.
Dissolve, really.
That's what it says. It can't survive in the light of your presence. It can only survive in your absence. You sustain unhappiness by giving it time, which the source calls its lifeblood. When you remove time through intense present moment awareness, it dies.
Wow.
So the source poses the question to you, the listener, do you want it to die? Have you truly had enough of this suffering? Who would you be without it?
That totally shifts the frame. It's not the feeling itself, but the unconscious identification with it through thought that sustains the suffering. That's a
Exactly.
lot to take in.
It is. And according to this material, it's only through this practice of surrender that what it calls the spiritual dimension becomes a living reality in your experience.
Mhm.
Before surrender, it remains an idea, something you might believe in or discuss, but not something you live.
So surrender is the gateway to a different kind of experience of reality, a different dimension.
Yes, and a different kind of energy. The source contrasts mind energy, the energy that has shaped our current world, our social, political, and economic structures, and is perpetuated by education and media with spiritual energy.
Mind energy versus spiritual energy.
Okay. Mind energy creates immense suffering, pollution, and is inherently dualistic, subject to polarity, good, bad, wisdom. Spiritual energy, however, is described as having a much higher vibrational frequency. It enters the world through surrender, creates no suffering, doesn't pollute, and is not subject to the law of polarities.
And the source suggests most people are operating purely on mind energy, unaware of this spiritual energy,
Yeah.
just running on the default program.
That's the picture painted. Spiritual energy belongs to a different order of reality, and according to the source, will create a fundamentally different world when enough humans are able to live from this surrendered state, free of negativity.
So it's not just personal, it's potentially world-changing.
Yes, this is presented not just as personal growth, but as essential for the Earth's survival. The source connects this to Jesus' statement in the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are the gentle, they shall have the earth for their possession," interpreting gentle as this silent, intense, present spiritual energy that dissolves unconscious patterns.
So whether your external conditions change or not, surrender means you are free internally.
That's the core idea. Your freedom isn't dependent on the outside.
Let's bring this back to relationships. That's where a lot of this plays out. The source addresses a common concern. What about people who try to use, manipulate, or control you? Am I supposed to surrender to them? Just let them walk all over me.
Right, a very practical question. And the source is very clear. Surrender absolutely does not mean allowing yourself to be used or manipulated. It describes people who operate this way as cut off from being, unconsciously seeking energy or power from others.
Okay.
But the key insight offered is that only an unconscious person can be used and manipulated. And if you react and fight their unconscious behavior from a place of resistance, you essentially become unconscious yourself. You get pulled down to that level.
So setting boundaries or saying no is possible while being surrendered. It's not about being a doormat.
Entirely possible, according to this material. It states it's perfectly possible to say no firmly and clearly to a person or to walk away from a situation and be in a state of complete inner non-resistance at the same time.
Inner non-resistance while saying no.
Yes. The crucial difference is the source of that no. Let it come from inner clarity, from a clear realization of what is right for you in that moment, not from reaction against the other person. This is called a non-reactive no, described as having a high quality, being free of negativity, and creating no further suffering.
A reactive no comes from the ego fighting. A non-reactive no comes from presence and clarity. That's a powerful distinction. That takes awareness.
It does. The source uses a workplace example. If a situation is unpleasant and you genuinely cannot surrender to the unpleasantness of that moment, then you must take action immediately. Speak up, do something to change the situation, or remove yourself from it entirely.
Take responsibility.
Yes, take responsibility for your inner state.
Yeah.
Don't allow unhappiness or negativity a dwelling place inside you. Don't pollute your inner being or the collective with it.
But what if you're in a situation where you truly cannot take external action or leave? Like if you were in prison. An extreme example, but it makes the point.
The source states that in such extreme cases, your only remaining choices are resistance or surrender, which means bondage to the situation or inner freedom from external conditions, suffering or inner peace. The inner choice, according to this material, always remains available.
So the inner state of non-resistance is primary, and that impacts how you engage with the outer world and relationships.
Yeah.
What about conflict, like arguments? How does surrender apply there?
This is where the source encourages observing the ego's mechanisms in action. In an argument, notice your defensiveness or aggression, your attachment to your own point of view, the intense need to be right and make the other person wrong.
Oh yeah, the need to be right.
Right. This, it says, is the energy of the egoic mind seeking dominance. The instruction is to make this energy conscious by simply acknowledging it, by feeling that urge to defend or attack fully in your body. The source suggests that in the middle of an argument, you might suddenly realize you have a choice.
A choice. in the heat of the moment.
Yes, and decide, maybe just for the sake of seeing what happens, to simply drop your reaction. That act is surrender.
Not just saying, okay, you're right, while internally fuming. Because that's not real surrender, is it?
Exactly, that would be the ego playing a cunning game, maybe feeling superior in its reasonableness. True surrender here means letting go of the entire mental, emotional energy field within you that is invested in fighting and being right.
The whole energy field.
Yes, the source cautions that the ego is indeed cunning, so this requires significant alertness, presence, and brutal honesty with yourself to truly disidentify from that mental position.
How do you know if you've genuinely surrendered in that moment? What's the feeling?
The sign, as described in the source, is unmistakable. You suddenly feel incredibly light, clear, and a deep sense of peace settles over you.
Lightness and peace.
Exactly. And then the source invites you to observe what happens to the other person's position and energy when you stop energetically fueling the conflict. True communication, it suggests, only begins when that identification with mental positions has dissolved.
This idea of non-resistance also comes up when the source discusses external conflict, like violence or aggression. How does that work? Surely you don't just stand there.
Yes, the source addresses this by clarifying that non-resistance in external conduct doesn't necessarily mean doing nothing. Any doing that happens from this state, however, becomes non-reactive.
Non-reactive action.
Right. The source points to the wisdom found in some Eastern martial arts, where you don't resist the opponent's force head-on, but yield to redirect and overcome it. Aikido comes to mind.
Yield to overcome. But there's also the potential for doing nothing, right? You mentioned that earlier.
Yes, the source mentions the Taoist concept of wu wei, often translated as actionless activity or sitting quietly doing nothing. This isn't born of fear or indecision, like freezing up.
It's different.
It's described as a state of intense inner presence and non-resistance, which, according to this material, can be a very powerful force for transforming and healing situations. Sometimes the most powerful action is inaction from a place of presence.
And if action is required in a dangerous situation, if you have to defend yourself.
The source suggests it will arise spontaneously from conscious presence, not from the conditioned, fearful mind. In that state, the mind is said to be free of concepts, even concepts like non-violence. So the response from this place is unpredictable from the ego's perspective. It's just appropriate action.
Appropriate action, not reactive action.
Exactly. The source contrasts the ego's idea of strength resistance, which it says actually cuts you off from true power, with the true power that comes from being. Resistance is portrayed as weakness and fear disguised as strength.
So the ego gets it backwards.
Completely. The ego, ironically, often perceives the purity and power of being as weakness because it's not loud or aggressive.
So letting go of resistance, becoming vulnerable in the ego's eyes, is actually revealing true invulnerability. That's quite a turnaround.
That's the paradox the source presents. The ego sees surrender as dangerous, but this material argues that only by letting go of resistance, by appearing vulnerable, do you access your true and essential invulnerability. The source states that without surrender, much human interaction is just unconscious role-playing and ego defenses.
Masks and games.
Right. Surrender drops those masks, making you simple and real.
Let's turn to some of the most challenging human experiences. Illness and disaster. The source directly asks, if you're seriously ill and surrender, wouldn't you lose the will to fight or get better? Doesn't surrender mean giving up the fight?
It tackles that concern directly. And again, the source emphasizes that crucial distinction. Surrender is the inner acceptance of what is happening this instant in your life now, not the overall conditions or circumstances of your life situation, which has a past and future. Illness is a part of the life situation.
So you don't surrender to the idea of illness. Like, I surrender to being a sick person.
No, absolutely not. The source suggests that the belief in the mental label illness gives the condition power and continuity in time that it otherwise wouldn't have. It becomes a solid identity.
But the label empowers it.
Yes. By focusing your attention on this instant and refraining from mentally labeling it, the overall illness is reduced to its immediate, present factors, perhaps physical pain, weakness, discomfort, disability. That is what you surrender to now. You surrender to the physical reality of the moment, not the conceptual overlay.
Surrender to the immediate sensations, not the narrative of being ill. Okay, I get that.
Exactly. And the source offers a profound perspective here. Use the suffering of illness to push you into the present moment, into a state of intense conscious presence. Use it as a pathway to enlightenment.
Use the illness itself.
Yes. Surrender, it suggests, doesn't necessarily change the situation directly. It changes you. And when you are transformed, your world, which it sees as a reflection of your inner state, is also transformed.
Like the mirror analogy you mentioned, work on the person, not the reflection.
Hmm.
Change yourself and the reflection changes.
That's the idea. Attacking the reflection is resistance. Accepting what is in the mirror makes it friendly. That's how you change the world, according to this source. It asserts that illness isn't the core problem. The egoic mind running rampant is.
So the mind's reaction to the illness is the real issue.
That's the perspective. So when you're ill, the instruction is not to feel like a failure, guilty, or to blame life or yourself. That's resistance. Use the challenging experience for awakening. Withdraw the element of time from the illness. Give it no past narrative or future dread. Let it force you into present awareness.
Become an alchemist.
Become an alchemist. Transmute the suffering into consciousness, the potential disaster into enlightenment.
The source mentions that if you feel anger about that idea while you're ill, it's a sign the illness has become part of your identity, that you're protecting it.
Yes, a sign that the condition has been incorporated into your sense of self and you're protecting that identity. The source emphasizes that the condition is not who you fundamentally are, and this applies just as much to major disasters.
Disaster, when your entire external world is crumbling. That feels like the ultimate test.
For the majority of people who are still largely identified with their egoic minds, the source suggests that only a critical limit situation, a major upheaval, loss, intense suffering, or facing death, has the power to potentially crack the ego's hard shell and force a state of surrender and awakening.
When everything falls apart.
Yes, the mind structure, which created their reality, collapses. And from those ashes, a new world can emerge.
But not everyone responds this way. Some people just get more bitter.
No, it's not guaranteed. The source notes some people's resistance actually increases, leading to a descent into even greater suffering, a kind of hell. Others experience a partial surrender, gaining depth and serenity. However, limit situations have also been catalysts for radical transformations.
Like the death row examples.
Exactly, citing examples like those on death row where intense, unavoidable suffering forced a complete acceptance of the unacceptable, leading to profound surrender and a state of grace and redemption. The miracle in these cases came from the act of surrender itself.
So, when disaster strikes, hold the awareness that there's potentially another side, just one step away, the alchemical shift from pain into something profound, even in the worst moments.
Exactly. The source clarifies that this isn't necessarily finding conventional happiness, but the fear and pain being transmuted into a deep inner peace and serenity that comes from a much deeper dimension from the unmanifested itself.
The peace of God.
It describes this as the peace of God which passes all understanding and suggests that compared to this, ordinary happiness is quite shallow. Along with this peace comes a realization, not as a thought, but as an absolute certainty in your being that you are indestructible, immortal.
That offers a completely different lens on suffering. But what if you're in an extreme situation where you simply cannot accept the external condition? It's just too much. The source offers a second chance.
Right. It acknowledges that, yes. In moments of overwhelming pain or trauma, fully accepting the external reality may seem utterly impossible at first. But even then, there's a second chance. The first chance, according to this material, is living moment by moment, accepting what is or isn't in the passaging. Now, doing what's necessary from that space and living in a state of non-resistance, grace, and lightness.
Living in the now is your default. And if you miss that first chance, if resistance takes over.
If you miss it perhaps due to a lack of presence, allowing unconscious patterns to take over, or because the external condition is truly unacceptable to the mind, then you create pain and suffering. The source is emphatic. The situation itself doesn't create the suffering. It is your resistance to the situation that does.
Okay, so the second chance is accepting the inner condition, the pain itself. If you can't accept the outside, accept the inside.
That's the alternative path described. If you cannot accept what is happening externally, then accept what is happening internally, the pain. Do not resist the pain. Allow it to be there, the grief, despair, fear, loneliness. Witness it without judgment or labeling. Embrace it.
Embrace the pain.
Yes, this is where, according to the source, the miracle of surrender occurs, transmuting deep suffering into deep peace. This is framed as your personal crucifixion leading to resurrection and ascension.
But if suffering is non-surrender, how can you surrender to suffering? That feels like a contradiction. I'm still struggling with that a bit.
It's a subtle point. The source suggests that when the pain is that deep, you can almost forget the word surrender. The automatic human response is to want to escape deep pain, right? But the source warns that pseudo-escapes like compulsive work, drinking, drugs, whatever, offer no true freedom.
They just numb it or postpone it.
Exactly. Denied or unacknowledged pain, it says, contaminates your life and attracts further negativity. The source states, when there is no way out, there is still always a way through. Don't turn away from the pain. Face it. Feel it fully.
Feel it, don't think about it. That line stood out.
Yes, this is the crucial instruction. Don't build a mental narrative around the pain. Don't create a victim identity. Give all your attention to the feeling itself, not to the story about why you feel it or who is to blame.
Just the raw feeling.
Right. Since you cannot escape the feeling in that moment, the only way to change it is to move into it. Give complete attention to what you're feeling and refrain from mentally labeling it. Be intensely present, intensely alert. It might feel dark, terrifying, and there will be an urge to turn away.
The urge to escape.
Observe that urge, but the instruction is to not act on it. Stay present with your whole being in every cell. This act, according to the source, brings light, the flame of your consciousness, into the darkness of the pain.
And that act of being fully present is surrender in that moment, even if you don't call it that.
According to this material, yes. At this level of intensity, you don't need to consciously think about surrendering. The intense presence is the surrender. Full attention is full acceptance, is surrender, the power of the five. Now, your presence removes the element of time, and without time, suffering and negativity simply cannot survive.
So accepting suffering fully becomes a kind of journey into conscious death, the death of the ego that's identified with the suffering.
That's how it's depicted. Facing deep pain with absolute presence is entering death consciously. And by dying this death, the death of identification with the painful state, you realize there is no actual death for your true self, nothing to fear. Only the ego structure dissolves.
The illusion dissolves.
It's like a ray of sunlight, realizing it was always part of the sun. The death is merely the dissolution of the illusion of separateness. The source asks if you want an easy death, suggesting that you can achieve this by dying to the past every single moment, allowing the light of your presence to dissolve the time-bound, separate self.
This seems to connect to the way of the cross concept the source mentions. Finding God through suffering.
It does. This is described as the old path to enlightenment, still valid. People historically found God not through their suffering itself, but through the act of surrender that their intense suffering forced them into. In that surrender, they realized the suffering was largely self-created through resistance.
And surrendering is equated with finding God, because it means the mind is no longer the master. The ego steps aside.
Precisely. Resistance is a function of the mind. Surrendering ends the mind's reign as the imposter, the false god in your life. Judgment and negativity, products of the mind, dissolve. And when the mind's clamor subsides, the realm of being, previously obscured, opens up, bringing stillness, peace, joy, love, the sacred dimension.
Finding God isn't finding something external.
No. The source clarifies that finding God isn't about locating something lost. It's realizing the life that you already are, that is already within you. God, in this perspective, is being itself, not a separate entity. God realization is presented as natural. The truly astonishing thing is our being unconscious of it.
So the way of the cross is a complete reversal. The worst possible thing, intense suffering, becomes the best, enlightenment, by forcing surrender, forcing you to become as nothing, like God being no thing.
Yes, to become as God, because God in this framework is described as no thing, the formless ground of all being. For the unconscious majority, this painful path is still presented as the primary way they will awaken.
Through crisis and suffering.
Yes, they will awaken through more suffering and upheaval, which the source sees reflected in universal patterns in text describing collective crises. This suffering is shown as resulting from human resistance inflicted on themselves, each other, and on the earth as it reacts to human madness.
But the source offers a more hopeful path, too, that a growing number of people can awaken without needing more suffering. We don't have to go through the ringer.
Yes, and you, the listener, may be among them. Enlightenment through suffering is described as a forced awakening, happening kicking and screaming, basically.
Right.
Enlightenment chosen consciously, however, means willingly relinquishing your attachment to past and future, making the present moment the central focus of your life, choosing presence, saying yes to what is. You don't need the catalyst of intense pain anymore.
You can choose it.
You can choose it. The source puts a direct challenge to the listener. How much more time, and therefore, according to this view, How much more pain do you believe you need before you can make the conscious choice to create no more pain?
Oof, that's direct.
It is. If you think you need more time, the source states you will get more time, and with it, more pain. Time and pain are inseparable.
That's a powerful call to awareness. Let's touch on one final idea the source brings up that might feel contradictory. Why do people appear to choose to suffer, for example, staying in abusive relationships? It looks like a choice from the outside.
The source states unequivocally that the word choose is inaccurate in these situations. True choice, it argues, requires a high degree of consciousness. Without that consciousness, there is no genuine choice.
No real choice without awareness.
Right. Choice only begins when you are able to disidentify from the mind and its conditioned patterns and become present. Until that point, you are described as spiritually unconscious, compelled by your conditioning.
Like being on autopilot.
Exactly. The source brings in Jesus' statement, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do," explaining that this isn't about conventional intellectual capacity, you can be brilliant and unconscious, but about spiritual unconsciousness, being identified with and run by the mind. Mental development without corresponding growth in consciousness, the source warns, can lead to significant potential for unhappiness and disaster.
So someone stuck in a cycle like abusive relationships isn't actually making a conscious choice to be there, even if they say they are.
According to this perspective, no, they have no choice because their mind, conditioned by past experiences, compulsively seeks to recreate what is familiar, even if that pattern is painful. The mind clings to the known.
Even if the known is awful.
Even if it's awful, because the unknown feels inherently dangerous to the mind, which can't control it. The present moment, which offers the possibility of something truly new, is ignored because it creates a gap in the mind's continuous timeline.
So the painful situation is self-created, but the self-creating it isn't the true self, but a past pattern running the show.
Exactly. It could be a deep-seated pattern connecting intimacy with abuse, or a core belief in unworthiness, or the pain body itself seeking to feed on familiar pain. The partner in such a dynamic is often seen as having complementary unconscious patterns. The situation is indeed self-created, but the self doing the creating is the conditioned mind, not the person's true essence.
So making an identity out of it is part of the trap.
Yes. And the source advises against making an identity out of being in such a situation.
And simply telling someone they chose, it reinforces their identification with the mind pattern. It makes it worse.
Yes, it locks them further into the problem, into self-blame maybe. Instead, the source suggests guiding them to access the observing presence behind their thoughts and emotions, teaching them about the pain body, inner body awareness, and presence itself.
Give them the tools for awareness.
Right, it's through accessing the power of the choice. Now that the grip of the conditioned past is broken, and then the source states, genuine choice becomes possible.
It's stated definitively. Nobody chooses dysfunction, conflict, pain, or even insanity.
That's the source's strong claim. These states happen, it says, because of a lack of presence, insufficient light to dispel the darkness of unconscious conditioning. Their lives are run by the conditioned mind because they are not yet fully awake.
The example of resentment towards parents is used again.
Right. If you still resent them, you are operating under the illusion that they had a choice in how they behaved, when their behavior was likely dictated by their own mind's conditioning, which, in this framework, is a form of insanity. Realizing this brings compassion, not resentment, because you can't resent someone's illness.
But if it's not a conscious choice, does that mean they aren't responsible? Where does responsibility fit in?
Good question. The source clarifies that while you may not have a choice in your conditioning if you are run by your mind, you absolutely still suffer the consequences of that unconsciousness and continue to create further suffering for yourself and others. You bear the burden of the fear, conflict, and pain generated by the unconscious patterns.
So you suffer the consequences regardless.
Yes. And it is often this suffering that eventually forces you out of that unconscious state. The consequences themselves become the teacher, eventually.
Which leads us beautifully back to forgiveness. This also requires consciousness and surrender. You can't just decide to forgive from the mind.
According to the source, yes, true forgiveness requires that shift. You cannot truly forgive yourself or others if your sense of identity is derived from the past, because the past is that identity for the ego.
The ego holds on to the past.
It does. It's only by accessing the power of the now, which is presented as your own true power, that genuine forgiveness becomes possible. The past, as a source of identity and pain, loses its power. You realize deeply in your being that nothing that was done by you or to you could ever touch or diminish your radiant, essential nature.
When you realize your essence is untouched.
Exactly. At that point, the very concept of forgiveness as something you need to consciously perform simply becomes unnecessary. It dissolves.
And how do you reach that profound realization? What's the key again?
The source's answer circles back to the core practice. Surrender to what is, and in doing so, become fully present. When you are truly present, the past simply ceases to have power over you. You no longer need it to define yourself. Presence, the now, is the key to unlocking that state where forgiveness is no longer a concept, but a lived reality.
This has been a deep exploration, really moving from that initial resistance to the word surrender to understanding it as a powerful inner practice that's actually the catalyst for true change, a way through suffering, and the path to accessing a different kind of power in reality. You started by sharing these sources and asking how acceptance could lead to progress. The source ends with a final question for the reader, and its answer. It's quite something.
It does. The question it leaves you with is, how will I know when I have surrendered? A question many might ask.
And the answer provided is, well, it's short.
When you no longer need to ask the question.
When you no longer need to ask the question. That's a perfect and perhaps slightly mind-bending place to end this deep dive. What does that imply about the state of true surrender, and perhaps even about the nature of our own intellectual inquiry into it? It's something to really sit with.
It suggests that the state itself is self-evident, right? It requires no validation or confirmation from the analytical mind that poses the question in the first place. The knowing is in the experience itself, not in the thinking about it.
Yeah, exactly. A powerful final thought from this material.
Indeed.
Well, this deep dive into the concept of surrender, guided entirely by the sources you provided, has certainly challenged a lot of assumptions and offered a completely different framework for understanding how to navigate life's difficulties. From perceived passive defeat to a path of powerful inner presence, quite the journey.
It truly is a radical shift in perspective if you really engage with it.
Right. And that wraps up our exploration for today. We hope this has given you some valuable insights into this unique perspective on surrender and something to consider as you continue to explore these ideas.